Welcome back to Nordic Arms and History. In this episode of War Profiles, we're taking a look at one of the most remarkable naval officers Denmark ever produced, Admiral Aage Helgesen Vedel. During the German occupation of Denmark in the Second World War, Vedel was faced with an impossible choice. It was either to hand over his own navy to the German occupiers or destroy the fleet himself. His decision on the morning of August 29, 1943, was to scuttle the entire Danish navy, and this became one of the most defining moments of the Danish resistance. Today, we follow his story from the early days of Copenhagen through the dark days of the occupation and to the quiet rebuilding of the Danish Navy after the war. Let's dive into the story of the man who sank his own fleet to save his honor.
Aage Helgesen Vedel was born on September 1, 1894 in Copenhagen, Denmark. He grew up in a navy family. His father, Helge Vedel, was a lieutenant and later deputy director of the naval dockyard at Holmen, so you could say that the smell of salt water and steel was in his blood from the start. As a boy, Aage would have grown up around the docks, watching ships come and go from the naval base that guarded Copenhagen for centuries. By the time he was old enough to choose a path, there really was no doubt where he was headed. In 1912, at just 18 years old, Vedel joined the Royal Danish Navy as a cadet. He began his training at a time when Europe was still relatively calm, but the clouds of war were already forming on the horizon. Denmark sat in an uneasy position, small, peaceful, and determined to stay neutral, yet right in the middle of two great powers, Germany to the south and Britain across the North Sea. For a young officer like Vedel, naval life in those years was a balance between tradition and adaptation. When the First World War broke out in 1914, Denmark stayed neutral. The Navy spent most of that war quietly guarding Danish waters, laying defensive minefields and keeping foreign submarines out of the straits. Vedel didn't get the kind of combat experience that shaped officers in other navies, but he gained something else, an understanding of restraint, careful diplomacy, and the value of readiness. Over the next 2 decades, he steadily rose through the ranks. In the interwar years, the Danish Navy was small, underfunded, and often overlooked, but Vedel earned a reputation as competent, calm, and professional, the sort of officer who gets things done without a fuss. By the late 1930s, the world was changing again. Germany was rearming, the Baltic region had become strategically vital. Denmark, still neutral and hopeful, found itself squeezed between two powerful neighbors. Inside the Navy, men like Vedel knew that if war reached to Danish shores, the little fleet might not stand much of a chance, but could still have an effect. When the war finally came in April 1940, Aage Vedel was already a senior officer, respected for his judgment and composure. He couldn't have known it then, but the next few years would make him one of the most central figures in the story of the Danish Navy, and one of its quiet heroes. April 9, 1940. At dawn, the German invasion of Denmark begins. Operation Vesterbund, the lightning campaign that brings German troops across the border and paratroopers into key cities, overwhelms Denmark in a matter of hours. For most of the Danish armed forces, there was little they could do. The country's tiny army and air force were no match for the Wehrmacht. The government surrendered after just 6 hours of fighting to avoid unnecessary bloodshed. But what about the Navy? The Royal Danish Navy was largely untouched that morning. Its ships sat moored in harbors across the country, Copenhagen, Korsør, and Frederikshavn, crews still at their posts, guns unmanned. For them, the question wasn't about how to fight, it was really just if they could fight at all. The order from the government was clear: stand down. The fleet was to remain in Danish hands, but not engage the Germans. For many officers, this was a bitter pill to swallow, but for Vedel, who was then serving as deputy head of the Marine Staff, it was a challenge of a different kind. The Navy might not fire a shot, but he understood something vital. If Denmark couldn't fight openly, it could act wisely. The following year, July 1941, Vedel was appointed acting chief of Navy Command. Only a few months later, on September 1st, he was formally made commander-in-chief of the Royal Danish Navy. It was the highest naval position in the country, but one of the most delicate jobs imaginable. Vedel now had to steer an entire service through an occupation. On paper, the Danish Navy continued to operate, maintaining harbors, sweeping mines, and guarding local waters. But in practice, they were caught between loyalty to their country and the demands of the German occupying authorities. It was a constant balancing act. The Germans wanted the Danish fleet to work for them, to keep the channels open and protect shipping vital to their war effort. Vedel, however, ensured that the Navy stayed as independent as possible, performing only those duties absolutely necessary and keeping the ships and crews firmly under Danish control. He walked a fine line between open resistance and quiet subversion, and for a time it really worked. But as the war dragged on, tensions inside Denmark grew. The resistance movement was becoming bolder. Strikes, sabotage, and protests spread across the country. The Germans grew impatient with what they saw as Danish hesitation and half-hearted cooperation. By 1943, it was clear that something was about to give. In late August that year, the German authorities issued an ultimatum to the Danish government: introduce martial law, crack down on unrest, and suppress resistance, or face direct German control. The Danish government refused this and resigned on August the 28th. The occupation shifted overnight from cooperative arrangement to one of full German authority. Vedel understood perfectly what that meant. Without the protection of the Danish government, the Navy was exposed. The Germans would almost certainly move to seize it. The ships, the weapons, everything. So, that night, at 10 p.m. on August 27th, Vedel called a secret meeting at the Naval Ministry in Copenhagen. He met with his senior officers to discuss one thing: what to do if the Germans tried to take the fleet. Out of that meeting came a simple but momentous order. If the Germans come for our ships, they are to escape to Sweden if possible. If not, scuttle all of them. 2 nights later, in the early hours of August 29th, the Germans made their move. Operation Safari was launched, a coordinated attempt to seize the entire Danish military. Trucks surrounded the army barracks and stormed naval bases. German officers arrived at the docks, demanding that the Danish crews surrender their vessels. But the Danes were ready. At 4:08 a.m., the coded signal was sent out: scuttle, scuttle, scuttle. Across the harbors from Copenhagen to Korsør, sailors rushed to their posts, not to fight, but to sink their own ships. One by one, the Danish fleet went down. Engines were destroyed, sea valves opened, charges detonated. Crews set fire to cabins and jumped ashore as their ships slipped beneath the surface. In just a few hours, the navy that had been built over generations was gone. Out of 52 larger vessels, a whole 32 were scuttled. 4 of them managed to escape to neutral Sweden. 14, however, were seized by the Germans before they could be sunk. Smaller craft like patrol boats and minesweepers shared the same fate, sadly. To outsiders, it must have seemed like defeat, but to the Danes this was an act of defiance, a deliberate choice to deny the enemy what they could not defend. After the chaos, the German admiral in charge, Hans-Heinrich reportedly told Vedel, "We have both done our duty." It was a rare moment of professional respect between enemies who understood each other, 2 naval officers bound by code even in wartime. For Vedel, the cost was enormous. The fleet was gone. Hundreds of sailors were captured or interned. But the honor of the Danish Navy had been preserved. It had not surrendered its ships, it had chosen the sea instead. In the months that followed, Vedel continued to walk a dangerous line. With the Navy effectively dissolved, he turned his focus to coordinating with the underground resistance. Danish officers helped smuggle escaped sailors and personnel to Sweden, where they formed what would be known as the Danish Naval Flotilla, a small group that trained and operated under Allied command during the rest of the war. Vedel also maintained quiet contact with the British intelligence, passing on information about minefields, shipping routes, and German naval operations in Danish waters. By 1945, as Germany's occupation began to crumble, Vedel was one of the few senior officers left with enough credibility to manage the transition back to Danish control. And on May the 5th, 1945, when the German forces in Denmark surrendered, Vedel worked alongside the British Navy to restore order in the ports, began minesweeping, and re-established Danish command structure. After 5 long years of occupation, Denmark's flag flew freely again. When the war ended in May 1945, Denmark was finally free again, but the navy that Aage Helgesen Vedel had commanded no longer existed. Most of its ships lay at the bottom of Danish harbors, their hulls rusting and masts just barely breaking the surface. For Vedel, liberation wasn't a time for celebration, it was a time for rebuilding. In those early post-war months, he oversaw the recovery of what could be salvaged. Some of the scuttled ships were refloated, repaired, and brought back into service. Others were lost forever, but the spirit of the Danish Navy, its professionalism and independence, had survived. Vedel was also tasked with reorganizing the fleet, retraining officers, and re-establishing Denmark's presence in northern waters. He worked closely with the Allied naval authorities to clear thousands of mines left behind in the Danish Straits, a massive job that would take years to complete. He also played a role in the delicate political process, rebuilding Denmark's internal reputation. During the occupation, Denmark had been accused by some of collaboration, largely because the government had surrendered so quickly in 1940. But the story of the Navy's scuttling helped change that image. It showed the world that Denmark had, in its own way, resisted, and that the Navy, under Vedel's command, had chosen honor over obedience. By 1947, Vedel had become one of the most trusted figures in Denmark's defense establishment. That year, he chaired a committee overseeing the return of Greenland from the U.S. wartime administration to Danish control. This was an early sign of how seriously the Arctic was already being viewed as strategically important. At the same time, the world was slipping into a new kind of tension, the Cold War. For Denmark, this meant finding a place between the two powerful blocs, NATO on one side and the Soviet sphere on the other. Vedel recognized that neutrality, the policy Denmark had clung to before the Second World War, was no longer realistic. So, he quietly began discussions with both Norway and Sweden about forming a Scandinavian defense union. This was to be a neutral Nordic alliance that might stand apart from both the East and the West. Those talks never fully materialized. Sweden preferred to remain neutral, and Norway eventually joined NATO. And so, in 1949, Denmark followed suit, officially joining the Atlantic Alliance. The following year, Vedel was appointed Denmark's flag officer to NATO, representing Danish naval interests within the new collective defense structure. He was instrumental in helping define Denmark's post-war naval strategy, focusing on coastal defense, mine warfare, and control of the narrow straits that linked the Baltic to the North Sea. Under Vedel's leadership, the Navy modernized quickly. New ships were built at Danish yards, old vessels fitted with updated weaponry, and training programs aligned with NATO standards. The small navy that had once sunk itself rather than serve an occupier was now a part of one of the largest military alliances in history, and it owed much of that transition to Vedel's steady hand. He wasn't a man who sought fame. By all accounts, Vedel was calm, thoughtful, and professional, rarely political, and always focused on the practical needs of the service. Sailors who served under him often described him as approachable but firm, a man who commanded respect without raising his voice. In 1952, Vedel commanded the royal yacht Dannebrog on a cruise to Greenland with King Frederick and Queen Ingrid. It was a symbolic journey, the first royal visit to Greenland since the war, and it reflected Vedel's lifelong connection to Danish sovereignty at sea. He continued to serve as Commander-in-Chief of the Navy until his retirement in 1958, marking nearly half a century in uniform. From a young cadet in 1912 to the highest naval office in the country, he had witnessed Denmark's most turbulent half-century firsthand. When Vedel finally stepped down, he left behind a navy that he was rebuilt, respected, and once again outward-looking. A navy that had gone from quiet neutrality through occupation and destruction to cooperation and renewal. In the years after his retirement, Vedel remained a respected figure in Danish defense circles. He occasionally appeared at naval ceremonies and commemorations of the August 43 scuttling, the defining event of his career. Vedel passed away on February 9, 1981, at the age of 86, and was laid to rest at Hørsholm churchyard. His legacy lives on not through monuments or politics, but through the character of the Danish Navy itself, a service that, when faced with impossible choices, still remembers the example set by Aage Helgesen Vedel. A man who proved that courage isn't always about firing the first shot. Sometimes it's about standing your ground and doing your duty, even if it means sending your own ships to the bottom.
Alright everyone, I hope you enjoyed this War Profiles episode. If you have any people you want me to make videos on, feel free to comment them down below. Also, as I mentioned last time, I actually do have a Patreon now, so I'll be posting that also down below. And also, if you feel like this video deserves it, leave it a like. Of course, I do like making videos on more obscure characters that not everyone really knows of, and I think that's really what the purpose of War Profiles is. And also, as usual, if you want to learn more about Nordic arms and history, consider subscribing. Until the next one, take care. Bye-bye.